First of all, thank you, Kelly and Dirk, for having us on the program. And also, I want to thank my wonderful co-authors, Noah and Lynn, and particularly Lynn is on the job market this year. So just a quick motivation for this paper. So when we look at like patterns of mobility in the managerial labor market at the largest public firms in the US, it seems to be a highly frictional labor market. So just some examples from Dirk and Peter's paper. Most CEO hires are promoted internally. Only 3% of CEO hires are actual poached CEOs. And when we look at the time series pattern in mobility, CEO mobility, moving to other firms seems to have peaked around the year 2000 and then fallen dramatically since. Now, really, while we're talking about this, we look at kind of some of the important theories and papers explaining this relationship or explaining the high patterns in pay that we see. They really rely on kind of a frictionless CEO labor market and a demand for general CEO skills driving up a premium and leading to high pay. And as Peter and Dirk point out in their paper, then we would expect to see more movement of CEOs across firms than we actually see in the data. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to ask kind of two very related questions. Number one, can firm-specific skill of CEOs and managers help explain this low mobility? And can it also help explain like the concurrent patterns that we see in pay as well? So what we're going to do in this model is we're going to pose and estimate a structural model of the managerial labor market. And just to give an idea of what we're doing, most of the literature in corporate finance, at least, tends to focus on the firm's perspective. Firm demand for managerial talent. We're going to switch things and think about things from the manager's perspective and think about how job opportunities, human capital, and like managerial bargaining power shape compensation and mobility over careers. What that model is, we're going to borrow basically what our friends over in labor departments have done and pose and estimate a model of a structural model of the labor market with on-the-job search. And in this model, we're going to have the full suite of job opportunities arriving for CEOs. And those job opportunities are going to arrive randomly and possibly rarely. We're going to embed these search frictions directly into the model. We're also going to have imperfect labor market competition. So managers have like bargaining power. They're able to extract surplus from firms. And then bargaining between firms and managers is going to determine these compensation contracts. And finally, we're going to have human capital accumulation. So managers are going to accumulate both general and firm-specific skill. And that composition of human capital is really going to influence like the retention and pay incentives of incumbent and poaching firms throughout managers' careers. So paper, we're going to estimate this model on ExecuComp data. It's very standard, the S&P 1500 firms in the US economy. And we have three main findings. So number one, firm-specific human capital plays an important role in the labor market for executives. So number one, when we look at compensation, this firm-specific skill seems to be an important driver of wage growth and wage levels. So over labor market experience, managers' time in the labor market, it's going to account for about 30% of that growth. And then we look at tenure at a specific firm. So you're staying at a firm, it's going to account for about 50% of that growth. And beyond compensation, firm-specific human capital is going to have a big impact on mobility as well. So when we think about what firm-specific skill does, it creates like unique human capital that is unique to your current firm. And switching firms is costly because you lose that skill, you lose that human capital. So, relative to a counterfactual where like firm-specific human capital has no impact on hiring decisions, this firm-specific skill is going to raise the observed rate of internal promotions by about 8 percentage points. So going from 66 to 74% internal promotions. So it's, it has a big impact, but, the remaining disparity between internal and external promotions is going to be driven by the search frictions, which we're estimating at the same time. So second finding, so we're going to shift from firm-specific human capital and think about managerial surplus capture and how that relates to managerial bargaining power. So in our paper, this surplus capture is going to be two things. So number one, there's going to be like exogenous bargaining power. That's just the manager's ability to extract some share of the rents produced by the match between the firm. And the second thing is going to be this imperfect labor market competition. So there's going to be, firms competing for managerial services over careers that's going to drive up how much surplus managers are able to capture from firms. Now, just a quick note before I get to the finding, why is this important? So when we think about quantifying the degree of agency frictions in pay setting, it's really important to kind of endogenize and think about the role of labor market competition. We're going to be able to decompose surplus capture into like exogenous bargaining power, and thinking about it, endogenous bargaining power caused by labor market competition. Just to give the finding there, so managers, overall, they capture about 50% of surplus created by matches with firms. This is similar to findings in the CEO literature. It's actually very similar to findings in the broader labor literature, looking at kind of standard workers. Bargaining power, on the other hand, is only going to allow managers to capture about 26% of that surplus. So that's like the exogenous amount of surplus they're allowed to capture. What does that mean? Is that labor market competition, firms competing for managerial services, is going to account for about half of that observed surplus capture. Okay, so we have first two findings. They seem a little bit loosely connected maybe, but I think kind of the main economic point of our paper is that firm-specific human capital, it impacts how much and the ways in which managers are able to extract surplus over their careers. So just a quick note. So in a search model, what kind of drives everything is the unique match quality between the firm and the manager. And just to kind of give one equation before I even explain the model, that match quality, there's going to be like a unique firm effect. That's just like a proprietary technology, if you like. And then this firm-specific human capital. And what does that mean is that match quality is going to change across the tenure of a manager, across tenure for a manager at a particular firm. And that's going to change the bargaining incentives of the incumbent and the poaching firms. Think about the incumbent. Not only is it costly for the manager to lose that firm-specific skill, it's going to be costly for the firm to lose that as well, because it could be very hard to find a manager of commensurate skill outside in the labor market. So two consequences. We already spoke about the job lock. It's going to lower the rate of cross-firm mobility, but it's going to lead to something that we call like retention rents, in that it's going to be optimal for the incumbent firm to cede a larger share of surplus in order to retain that firm-specific skill at the firm, rather than let the manager walk away and take an outside job offer. And look, we're not going to say that this is like gives the full explanation for the patterns that we see, but this is giving some explanation for this. It's a market-based explanation of like these observed patterns in compensation, where we can see managers capturing rents over their careers at firms, but also that low rate of mobility in the CEO labor market. So just a very, very quick literature review. So there's, a big literature has developed following Dirk and Peter's Market for CEOs paper. And I just want to kind of point out there's this paper by Murphy and Zabanik, it's really, really very, very related to our paper. The only difference between these two papers really is the assumptions about labor market competition. They're considering frictionless, competitive labor market. We're embedding like an imperfectly competitive labor market with search frictions. Okay, so let me just get into the model. So it's going to be a very, very simple model, really. So there's going to be a labor market consisting of firms and managers. Firms are just going to be like managerial job slots that are vacant and looking to be filled or occupied and producing. Managers can be in one of three different employment states. So they can be the CEO at the firm. They can be a non-CEO executive, which we're just going to call an executive in like an abusive parlance. Or they can be unattached. And unattached, it's not the same as unemployment, just means that you're not currently employed at a public firm in our sample. So we have these three different employment states. Managers are going to receive kind of state-dependent employment shocks, which are going to just be Poisson arrival rates throughout their careers. And just the key thing to point out here is that, look, we're going to have different arrival rates, different parameters representing the rate at which internal promotions and external CEO offers arrive. And that's going to embed in the background of our model like a search friction. You can think of this, there could be a preference for insiders embedded in this parameter, although it's kind of outside the structure of the model. In terms of production and how human capital impacts that, so we're thinking about output, in particular log output per worker at a firm or per manager at a firm. And it's going to be composed of four things. So there's like A, which is just manager heterogeneity. Like think of that as like natural ability. There's going to be firm heterogeneity. Think of that as just something like firm specific, like size, as I mentioned, proprietary technology. And there's going to be two things that vary across managerial careers. So number one, we have this general component of human capital. And that's going to be a function of experience T. So that's going to be accumulating as long as a manager is in the labor market. The other thing is firm-specific human capital. That's going to be a function of tenure, tau. And the key thing about firm-specific human capital, very simple, is that it's non-transferable. So when you switch firms, you lose that firm-specific human capital. And what that's going to mean is that we're going to see kind of endogenous changes, endogenous variation in a manager's human capital across their careers. Okay, so we've got this kind of this production function. it's very useful to think of this in terms of a general component, the component that applies across any firm, versus a match-specific component. When we think about this match-specific component, I'm just going to define this quantity P, which is going to be this component of productivity that's tied to the current match and that is going to be lost when you switch firms. And we'll get into it in more detail, but the dynamics of P, and particularly the dynamics of the K component, the firm-specific human capital component of P, are going to play a large role in determining whether or not managers accept decisions to switch firms and ultimately the rate of mobility that we see in the economy. Okay, so compensation and bargaining. So we are going to solve for like compensation contracts in our model for kind of every possible employment transition that you can have. We are going to make a simplifying assumption and say that the compensation contract dictates that the manager receives a share of the output that they produce in the firm, a piece rate, if you like. This R between 0 and 1 is going to determine how much they get. That R is going to be determined by bargaining between incentive and possibly poaching firms and the manager. We're going to put things in log wages for the rest of the paper and just kind of think of, R is going to max out at 0. That's when the manager, little r is going to max out at 0. That's when the manager captures all of the surplus. And the other cases, it's going to be less than 0. So quick note on piece rate contracts. So, this really is not embedding kind of the particulars, all of the particulars of incentive contracts that we've discussed at this conference so far. All of this incentive is totally implicit in this number between 0 and 1. Key thing here is that it does make this direct link between output and pay. But, really we're assuming in the background, much like Taylor 2013, that any kind of negotiated future pay incentives are included in the current piece rate, and they're going to, induce the manager to deploy their human capital at the firm at this current moment. Okay, so just a quick note on how we solve for these things. It's going to arise out of kind of cross-firm bargaining, firms bargaining for managers, and the managers bargaining with the firms who is ultimately going to hire them. So we've got these different arrival rates for the different job opportunities. And when these job offers arrive, the manager and firm, or possibly two firms, are going to bargain over the match surplus produced by that possible match. So we've got an internal promotion. There's no outsider, so just the firm and the manager are going to bargain. It's going to be basically a Rubinstein counteroffers bargaining game. And ultimately, what's going to happen is that the manager is going to get a share of that surplus depending on this exogenous bargaining power. It gets a little bit more interesting when we have an external job offer, because here we have the case where two firms are competing. You can think of that as like a Bertrand competition. This competition between the firms is going to drive up how much surplus the manager is able to capture. And then ultimately, we're going to have this same kind of bargaining between the firm and manager, determining that compensation contract, that piece rate. And you can just think, to kind of summarize the piece rate, it's going to be determined by two things. Number one, this inherent managerial bargaining power, and then this strength of the manager's outside option, or like the best offer from that competing firm. Okay, so after solving for all of these contracts and kind of a few assumptions we make about CEO utility, it's not super important. What is this is going to allow us to do is kind of take the distribution of possible job offers. So any job offer that a CEO or a manager could receive, I'm going to focus on CEOs in this slide. It's going to allow us to split those job offers into 3 different regions. So number one, and I guess your left, we're going to have the super boring region where nothing happens. This would be like, Jeff Bezos getting an offer from Staples to be CEO. He's just going to put it in the bin, not worry about it. On the kind of far right in the blue region, we've got the case where this outside offer is productive enough, or the match is good enough that it's going to be optimal or right for the manager or the CEO to take that outside job offer and sacrifice their firm's specific human capital. A key point there is that we're not going to talk about it too much today, is that when a manager is going to switch firms, this outside job offer has to compensate them for the value lost from giving up that firm's specific human capital. And now the interesting region is this middle green region here. And I'm going to define just a quantity here called LB, lower bound. And just think of this is like the threshold position where the manager would be indifferent between kind of letting firms compete to get a new contract and just staying in the current contract. But the key thing with our paper is that, given a very believable assumption about the distribution of firms outside job offers, we can show that this renegotiation region is growing as the manager accumulates firm-specific human capital. What does that mean? I've just said that in terms of totally mathy terms. It means that the incumbent firm, because that firm-specific human capital is is valuable and it's costly to lose that. You're not going to be able to find somebody who has a similar level of skill out inside in the labor market. The incumbent firm is going to be willing to match a greater proportion of outside job offers, give up a little bit more of the match surplus between them and the current CEO in order to keep the CEO at the firm. And this is the idea of retention rents. You know, over time, these attractive outside offers, they're not going to lead to job switches, but they're going to lead to improvements in the CEO's contract across the firm. And I'll give you some empirical, some quantitative evidence in a couple minutes. Quick note on the data I mentioned, it's execu-comp. So, you know, you think about this is a selected sample. It's really S&P 1500 firms, the largest firms in the US economy. So this, if you want to position our results, we're really thinking about the managers of these types of firms. We're going to estimate, you know, our measure of compensation is going to be total expected pay. So it's going to include like measures for the expected value of future incentives in that current pay. So just parametric specifications, a couple more. The key one here is that we're going to allow these human capital accumulation functions to be cubics. And what does that mean is that basically we have some flexibility. They can be linear, they can be concave, they can be convex, and we're going to let the data tell us what those shapes are. And in terms of identification, so it's going to be indirect inference. So what we're going to do is we're going to formulate like a set of moments, which could be misspecified. I'll talk about that in a second, but they have to be informed about the structural parameters. We've kind of got three buckets of parameters that really matter. These arrival rates, we're going to match dynamics, like how's the rates of transitions between employment states. Human capitalization is going to come from, you know, experience and tenure profiles across wage levels and wage growth, which I'll talk about in a second. And this bargaining power is going to be identified by, you know, managers switching firms, holding constant, you know, tenure, experience, firm, both incumbent and poacher effects, along with worker effects to really identify that switch premium, that bargaining power change in wages. And just to give a flavor of kind of the key identification argument. So because we have this kind of this structural wage process, which is, you know, a function of experience, tenure, general and specific human capital, a firm effect and a worker effect, we're just going to fit like a standard labor economics Mincer AKM style equation. And the key thing with identification, let's just focus on the firm-specific human capital component. That's going to be identified by variation in wages across tenure, holding experience constant. So we need kind of a mismatch there, holding firm effects constant and holding worker effects constant. And kind of, I think the key to the identification already, why we can't do this in reduced form, is that what we see, we don't see in the data this R. This is the piece, right, the effect of the labor market competition. And that's going to be, you know, correlated with these other components in very kind of nonlinear and complex ways. Our identification argument is going to be about kind of matching that misspecification using our structural model and then backing out the parameters that drive that misspecification. Okay, so just a quick note on the data match. So what I'm showing you here, so let's pretend panel C is not there right now. What I'm showing you in panels A and panel B are from this regression here, the predicted experience and tenure accumulation profiles. So take those coefficients from those tenure and experience profiles and just plot them on the observed data, the orange, and the simulated data, the blue. And as you can see, you know, we're matching these accumulation profiles very well, at least from this one regression. And one point here is that, look, these things are all in the same scale. We can move over to panel C now. This is like the structural accumulation profiles for general and firm-specific human capital effectively. As you can see, there seems to be kind of an upward bias in experience in the data and a downwards bias in tenure, given the structural coefficients. And that's driven by this idea that, you know, if you think about a manager's career, you're going to receive these outside job offers generally later on in tenure. That's going to lead to a mechanical upwards correlation with experience because of these wage increases you see when you switch firms. Okay, so that's the match. So get into the results now. So what we're going to do in this results section is just take our simulated data and just do an analysis of the managerial labor market. So we're going to do a couple of things. So the first thing is think about the impact of firm-specific human capital on mobility. Again, taking this counterfactual where firm-specific human capital has no impact on job movement, and just compare that to like the actual world that we estimate. And as we can see, you know, we see about an 8 percentage point drop in the rate of internal CEO promotions. And the large portion, about 6 percentage points or 75% of that is going to poached CEOs. what's going on here is that, just based on the frictions in the model, you become a CEO later on in your career after you've accumulated a lot of firm-specific human capital, got a lot of, surplus captured. It's going to be hard to poach you away. When you remove that effect, poaching CEOs becomes much more common. And in terms of the impact of, decomposing compensation growth and figuring out how human capital impacts things here, what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of look at wage growth across a manager's career, so all managers, not just CEOs, and just decompose that each year how much of that growth is driven by the different components of human capital, and of components that drive wages, I should say. So kind of the key thing here is that when we look at experience, so this is just experience in the labor market, firm-specific human capital, it starts off being really important, and it ends up, it's about 30% of overall wage growth. The other stuff that matters is the piece rate, which is like contractual returns, which I'll talk about in a second. That's like getting a new contract from outside job offers. Match productivity, that's like basically switching firms and moving up in the distribution of offers and getting higher wages. And then in tenure, there's no movement, of course. We're just thinking about contiguous tenure. Firm-specific human capital is kind of the key driver over tenure, about 50%. So I spoke a little bit about these green lines here. So I want to dive in a little bit here, and kind of this, I think, will clarify the usefulness of a structural model in this setting. In our paper, contractual improvements can occur through two channels. So number one, you can switch jobs. You force your new firm and your old firm to compete to give you a better contract. And the other one is the opposite there, the renegotiation. So you basically, an outside firm is like, hey, we like this manager, we want to hire them. And your current firm ultimately matches that outside offer and improves your contract. We can actually like perfectly decompose contractual returns into those two channels. So I'll tell you why there's only one line in this plot in a second, but when we look at returns to experience, a pretty sizable portion of total contractual turns, total like improvement in surplus capture for managers is driven by this renegotiation. And the key thing there, that's unobserved in the data, more or less, I think. Now, why we don't see this over returns to tenure, it's a very obvious, but I think an important point to make is that all contractual returns over tenure are due to renegotiation. So this kind of when we see, job improvements for CEOs over tenure, it's coming through, at least in our structure model, through this renegotiation channel. Okay, so now we can transition into this bargaining power decomposition. So managers are sampled, as I said in the introduction, they capture about 50% of surplus. It's going to vary depending on observables. It's very consistent with Taylor 2013, which is kind of a landmark paper in this literature. Exogenous bargaining power would only give them 26% of surplus. Think about managerial pay, it's those two components, bargaining power and bidding for CEO services, for manager service, and our estimation is going to allow us to decompose that perfectly. So I'm not going to get into the full details here, but we think about when we don't have a model of labor market competition, it must mean that any surplus capture that we ascribe to a manager is relative to like the least productive position, or kind of the minimum outside option that they can have. And we can kind of take our model and perfectly do this decomposition. And what this B is going to capture is exactly that. So relative to kind of like the minimum position that a manager or a CEO can have, what is their share of the surplus capture? And a key thing about this surplus capture B is that it's going to be bounded below by the exogenous bargaining power, because they're always going to get this amount. That's just like how much they get, like absent any competition. And it's going to be bounded above by 1 because, they can't capture more than 100%. Then we can just do a super simple decomposition and just ask how much of this observed surplus capture is bargaining power versus the residual labor market competition. And on average, so labor market competition is going to be about 50% of that observed surplus capture. So remember, they capture 50% of surplus, 50% of that is going to be labor market competition. It's going to vary across experience. So the more experience you have, the more capture you can surplus, the higher impact of labor market competition. And it's really going to vary across CEO hires. So externally hired CEOs, they basically have really good outside options. Effectively, if you want to hire them, you have to give them a lot, and they end up developing a large degree of surplus capture driven by labor market competition. Key caveat here is that we're holding managerial bargaining power fixed across managers, and particularly manager type, CEO versus executive. So last thing, so I know I'm really running out of time, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. So just to connect firm-specific human capital and this surplus capture channel. So there's going to be two effects of firm-specific human capital on managers' rent extraction. So number one, there's this job loss. That's going to lead to like weaker external bargaining power because it's going to decrease the propensity that managers have to extract surplus from taking outside offers. So switching firms to get a better contract. But it's actually going to give them, in equilibrium, a perfectly counterbalancing effect, stronger internal bargaining power. This is really this idea of retention rents, because the manager is going to be more able to avail of contractual improvements by effectively the incumbent firm ceding more surplus in order to keep that firm-specific skill around. And those are going to cancel out in equilibrium, but it's going to shape the path of contractual improvements over careers. So again, we're going to do this counterfactual where we think about comparing the baseline to a world where firm-specific human capital has no impact on these dynamics of rent extraction. And as you can see that there's this shaping here. So over experience in the baseline, the amount of surplus capture the manager is going to capture in the model with firm-specific human capital is going to be significantly lower than the one without firm-specific human capital. But there's going to be this effect over tenure where they're going to capture more. And that's those retention rents having this impact. Okay, so I won't go through the conclusion, but really looking forward to what Nick has to say, and thank you all.